Sometimes magic is right where you find it, and that certainly applies to big chunks of metal forged in fire that once held back tons of racing steel. Aged and wizened with rust and full of power, I'm going to share the story of my first experience with railroad spike magic and show you how I made a home protection ward out of one. I'm also going to share some other resources to learn more about how other traditions work with railroad spikes in their magic. Coming up next. Welcome to the Witch's Studio. I am, of course, Mickie Mueller, author, illustrator, and witch, not necessarily in that order. And today we're going to talk about railroad spikes. I'll show you how to witchcraft and enchant a ward for home protection like the one that I made. I love magical methods to empower your own life with spells, easy to craft supplies, and practical tips. So if you want more of that in your life, it just takes a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so that you'll always be able to find your way back to my studio for more magic. Ever since I first found a railroad spike on my property years ago when I lived in the country, I felt it was protective. When I picked it up and I held it, I could feel the energy of it. I don't think there's a magic user alive who would hold one of these and not declare, I must use this for magic. Give me a thumbs up on this video if you've ever picked up something and knew it was magical. Knowing it was a railroad spike, I thought about it being driven into the ground by a very strong man wielding a huge hammer. I could practically hear the clanging in my head. I thought about how it spent all those years anchored in the earth and how it must have collected energy over the years of holding down those tracks while trains rumbled over them. I wondered if it still somehow was energetically connected to that stretch of track that it once served. Could the power of trains passing over even today somehow reverberate through the realm of spirit and connect with it? It was heavy for its size, and I thought it must be iron, which I know is full of protective energy. I noticed the rust and pitting that had developed on it, and that's made when iron is exposed to oxygen and water. I knew rusty nails were used in all kinds of protection spells, including the classic witch's bottle. I have a video up here all about those. And rust always reminds me a bit of blood, which is quite powerful. And also blood is full of iron as well. Railroad spikes weren't mentioned in any of the books that I had at the time, so I just asked it if it wanted to work with a witch. In response, I kept feeling guided to set it on my front porch rail in that weird way that objects sometimes answer you with a vision or just a sense of knowing. I kept that big iron spike and a horseshoe on my porch's protection wards for years after that. That particular spike still lives on my Hecate altar. A couple of years later, I ended up with some locally sourced rusted spikes that were removed during maintenance to be replaced. These are really old. So I decided to make a magical ward, adding my own magic and flourishes to a single spike that's inspired by the one I found years ago, and I thought you might like to see how I made it. But that story is my own personal witchcraft connection to railroad spike magic. I must address that I learned years later after I found that first spike that there are many magical traditions like hoodoo, conjure, root work, brujeria, and santeria that use railroad spikes for protection and other forms of magic. These traditions include rituals that are specific to their faith and practice and culture. I don't teach those spells or methods because they're not mine to teach. There are lots of other people who belong to those traditions that have shared their methods in books, videos, and articles. If you want to learn more, I suggest that you check out the cover award-winning book, Good Juju, by my beautiful friend, Najah Lightfoot. I bought the ebook version, and it's a great read. Also, check out her YouTube channel. Her book has some great information and insight about railroad spikes and lots of her personal experiences with her spiritual practice that includes hoodoo, African folk magic, and European paganism. Her book is accessible to many seekers of many backgrounds, and she welcomes the reader in with humor and kindness to learn ways to begin or enhance a spiritual practice. I also wanted to share a couple videos made by people of other traditions that are not my own so that you can discover more ways that they use railroad spikes in their magic. I think respect for many various magical traditions is so important. So I hope that you check out these wonderful teachers and see what they have to say on the fascinating topic of how railroad spikes are sometimes used. As you watch, keep in mind that different traditions do things in different ways. When someone says we always do this or we never do that, in these cases, they're referring to their belief and culture within their own practice. Various magical approaches all work because the method that the person's using is aligned with their own intention and beliefs of the magic, including their own experience and what they've learned from their own teachers. While we do see differences between magical lineages, learning about other traditions can show us our similarities too and dispel misunderstandings while fostering support for each other. A railroad spike is a piece of history, and we should address that when working with them. The back-breaking work of driving these spikes into the ground to fasten them to the tracks was often done by Chinese immigrants, but there were also large numbers of formerly enslaved Black Americans as well as Irish immigrants, and some First Nations people as well. All of these workers were exploited terribly, but there were huge pay and working condition disparities depending on the race of each worker. It was the mid to late 1800s. However, let's face it, that sadly some of that discrimination still lives on to this day. I personally feel that it's important to take a moment to spiritually honor the workers who built the railroads as I dedicate a railroad spike for magic. We can also honor them further by continuing to consciously work on anti-racist efforts. Railroads aren't about division, they're about connecting people. Most railroad spikes are made of carbon steel, which is an alloy of mostly iron. Less than 1% of carbon is added for strength, and that's between 0.30% and 0.60% carbon. That's not very much. So while most railroad spikes aren't pure iron because it's much more brittle, there is a very high content of iron in the alloy that these are made of, sometimes including trace elements of nickel or chromium as well. From a magical standpoint, we can apply the correspondences of iron to this because that's what they are mostly made of, even though from an engineering standpoint, they're technically carbon steel. But we're not building a railway. We're going to be making some magic with this hefty little spike. So where do you get these? Some people find them discarded along railroad tracks, but be careful of property laws. They should be respected, and never ever try to remove one that's currently in use. Removing spikes from active tracks risks countless lives of other people and jail time for yourself. I have to add a warning about hanging around on the railroad tracks themselves because I'm a mom and trains are dangerous. You can also find them at garage sales, estate sales, or rummage sales. If you can't find them locally, you can usually find them online. There's a link below. They're not very expensive, and if you want to pick up a few or try working some railroad spike magic, or even make one of the protection wards that I'm about to show you. If you like mine and you don't want to gather the other supplies or go through the time and energy of the whole ritual of making one, I will have a limited batch available in my Etsy shop for a short time. They're all magically crafted, charged, and ready for use. I'll show you how I've added layers of magic, intention, and other protective magical elements to every step of creating this ward. Come on, I'll show you how. I gathered all my supplies, and I'm working on a table where I have a plastic tablecloth because I don't want to get paint or glue on anything. And I've got my Railroad spike, as you can see, it's old, it's rusty, and those are the ones that are most valued in magic. It has to have been used and has all that energy running through it. I've got an herb blend and an oil blend that I'm using. I will have information out to the side when I use those to show you what's actually in those ingredients. I've already mixed them before I started. Now this particular lot of spikes that I have been out in the sun and the rain and the snow. They've been cleared by the natural elements of any unwanted energy. But I'm using the smoke and my intention to extend gratitude and blessings to the workers who worked on this railroad. As I mentioned before, these workers were not treated particularly well, so I feel it's time that they were given their due. This is a tool that I want to use with all respect. When I came up with the idea to make these into charms, I realized that the rust could create a problem for anyone who wanted to hang these on their wall, and I didn't want rust on my wall, so I decided to apply some cork to the back of this in order to protect the wall that it hangs on. Anytime you're adding something like an adhesive, it's also an opportunity to include some more magic. Here is the formula for this herbal blend that I created for this project. You don't have to use the same protective herbs that I did. This is just what I had on hand. You can use any protective herbs that you like if you decide to make something similar to this. I do suggest that you grind it quite finely, and a little bit goes a long way. I already charged these herbs as well. I did that off camera. And now I'm going to add the cork back, sealing in a layer of magic. I also added a small piece of cork to the top piece because it juts out a little bit and it just made the cork lay a little flatter. I applied some blue painter's tape, which is low tack, to hold it in place while it dries. I did this in the afternoon, so I decided to wait until the following day to continue on. I didn't want to risk that cork slipping out of place while I am pulling the cord over it. I started with 2.5 yards of cotton cord. It's dyed red, and I matched the ends up, and in the middle of it, I'm tying just a very simple double knot as flat as I can make it, and that is going to create the hanger of this magical board. You don't have to use the same cord that I used. You could use hemp or jute or any kind of cord that you like. Now I'm going to attach it there to the back using my E6000 glue. Again, you don't have to use that kind of glue. It's just what I use for my products that I sell in my Etsy shop because it works well for me. And then I'm tying a nice tight knot to hold it in place, and I'm going to leave it sit for about 2 hours just to make sure that it's good and set. While we wait, I made an essential oil to put on my bat nuts.
Do you want to try that again?
No. I'll leave my formula out to the side there so that if you want to make something similar, you can. But again, use whatever protection oil that you like on your bat nuts. There will be a link in the description in case you want to pick up a few of these little bat nuts, devil's pod things. They're really cool. And now I'm just charging it with my intention, telling it what I want it to do to protect the home. I am ready to start tying these square knots. I always start on the right-hand side. I'll show you why in just a little bit. The right cord loops over the top of the centerpiece. In this case, that's the railroad spike. Grab the left cord, that loops underneath and then up through that loop. And now you just pull them tight. You're basically tying a knot around the railroad spike. This is some really cool knot magic. And of course, I'm tying my intention for magical protection for the home into each knot as I tie. The next knot, you will do the opposite. You'll start with the left string and loop it over the top. The right string goes underneath and through. With square knots, it's important that you alternate left and right, because if you do it from the same direction all the time, it'll end up being a spiral instead of your knots alternating on both sides. I like the way the square knot lines up on the shape of the railroad spike, because bat nuts are natural. They are all a little bit different shape. So I kind of just had to decide which way it would set on there the best. And then I used the cord to secure it to the railroad spike. I just made an X, and this is the fun part. Yeah, I love these things. And look how spiky that is. It's obviously protective. As you can see, tying it to the back was a bit of a challenge. I didn't want to set it down and risk breaking off any of those little spiky parts. So I kind of had to tie it in the air, which is sort of extra, but as you can see, I managed it. Of course, if you needed to, you could secure that bat nut with a little dot of glue. I found that lifting the spike off the table makes it a little bit easier to continue on with those knots. This is actually a macrame technique that we used to use back in the 70s to make plant hangers and all kinds of interesting things. And we used it in the 90s as well to make hair wraps and friendship bracelets. Of course, when we're using it for a witchcraft item like this, you just focus on your intention with every knot, and you can even whisper your intention as you pull it tight. I always start with my loop on the right at the beginning. That way, if I lose count, I could count down how many rows I've done, and I know if I should be on the left or the right at that point. You can see I did that a couple of times. When you've worked your way down the spike to the point where you want to stop, which is where I'm at right here, I'm going to create another knot at the bottom because, you guessed it, I'm not done adding magic to this yet. I just loop both pieces of cord around and create one single knot to hold it in place. And there it is so far. It turned out really nice. And now I have a couple metal charms I'm going to attach to the bottom. I have a key charm to open opportunities and lock out anything baneful. And a watchful eye charm to cast a gaze of protection over everything. There's really no good way to attach these by themselves, so I'm adding these little caps that I found. I just love these. And these caps will fit right over the end of the cord, and I can attach the charm to that cap using a jump ring. A jump ring is just a circle of metal that has a little split in the side, and you open them by twisting them. Always use this twisting technique instead of trying to pry it open. As I'll show you, if you do it this way, it's really easy to get them to line up when you go to close them again. I simply drop both the cap and the charm right onto that jump ring, and it doesn't matter in what order you do this, and then you simply twist it closed again. I know some of these techniques might be new to you and stuff that you haven't tried before, but it's always valuable to learn something new that you can apply to your magic. There's what it looks like when it's finished. As you can see, it's all one piece now. And there's where I will put the cord. And I'm just going to go ahead and repeat that same process with the key. Let me know in the comments if anybody makes their own jewelry. If you do, you're probably familiar with this technique. And if you haven't made your own jewelry, you can use this method to try it. Now that they're assembled, I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick smoke cleanse on them. It's much easier to cleanse them once they're assembled than it is to try to do the individual pieces. And of course, now I'm going to charge them with my intention that they watch and guard over the home. Now, in order to attach those caps onto this cord, I need all of the fibers to be bound together. If I were using a poly cord, I could just burn the edge to keep it together. But as you can see, the little fibers, they won't really go into the cord without some help. So I got some inspiration. Just a little acrylic paint, and I'm using this red that's a similar color. And of course, it's an opportunity to add a little more magic. I decided to include this red ochre that I got from WhiteRaven's shop. And I'm adding just a little bit in there. I would have mixed it in a separate container, but this one was almost empty anyway, so no big deal. Now I'm lining up the charms to see where I want them to fall on the charm, and so that I'll know right where to cut that cord. That's nerve-wracking because once you've cut it, of course, you're done. So double checking is a really good idea. Now I'm dipping the end of the cotton cord into the paint, just enough to coat the end that's going to go into the cap, so it doesn't need to be a lot. Now when I twist that cord in the direction that it's formed in, the paint that's infused with the red ochre will hold those little fibers together. If you've ever left acrylic paint on the end of a paintbrush, you'll know that this will hold really well. It's kind of like the end of a shoelace that we're making ourselves. And as you can see, those are going to work out great. Now that I look like I've committed a murder, I'm going to just let that dry a little bit. Once I've cleaned up my crime scene and it looks like they are dry now, dry enough to attach the caps, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this turns out. Just a little dot of E6000, it doesn't take much. And you don't want it to ooze out of the caps when you push them on. So you want just enough that will hold it on the inside there. And another little dot on the other side. There we go. It worked great. I'm really happy with this. And I'm glad that it was another opportunity to add an extra layer of magic to this protection charm. Look at those. I had to admire my work for a few minutes. I'm so happy with how those turned out. And now I'm going to bless them in the name of the elements. We're using dragon's blood incense smoke for the element of air. We're going to bless it by the element of fire, being very careful not to let those charms drop inside, but letting the heat from the fire really activate that. I'm going to use some of my moon water to bless it with the element of water. And of course, bless it according to your tradition. You don't have to do it exactly the way I do. There are many different ways of doing things. However you do it will work as long as it's in alignment with your practice and beliefs. Finally, I have this beautiful little dish that I got from Mint Fairy, and I filled it with salt, and I'm allowing it to rest on the salt and sprinkling a little salt on it. This is for the element of earth. Now that I've blessed it, I'm going to go ahead and enchant it one more time with my intention that it is a guardian for the home, because it's no longer all of these little separate elements of magical pieces and bits and bobs. It's now one charm, one ward, and in this way I feel it brings the whole magical working together into a ward that is a powerful piece of protection magic. You can hang it on a nail over or near your front door or in any room in your home that you feel guided to place it. It can also rest on your altar during protection spells. If you feel it needs to be recharged at any point, you can just anoint it with a very small amount of any protection oil, such as olive oil, clove, or frankincense, and set it outside under a full moon to bless it, or just recharge it in any way that suits you. I hope you got inspired by seeing my process of creating this magical charm, and maybe you'll try one of your own. Remember, if you loved it but you don't want to make your own, I do have a limited amount of them in my Etsy shop for a short time. The link is in the description. As we've learned, there are many ways to use railroad spikes, but there are also other ways to create protective wards. I really like to work magic with what I have on hand. So if you don't have railroad spikes, think about other ways that you can create a magical ward. Perhaps rusty nails in a charm bag, maybe enchant any other piece of iron that you have. Let me know down in the comments if you have any stories about working with railroad spikes or other iron that you've used for magic. Also, give me a thumbs up if you learned something new today. Don't forget to share this video with your witchy friends. They'll really appreciate learning something new too. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed and cast a spell on the notification bell so that you'll magically know as soon as I upload a new video. Thanks again for visiting me here. I have a few more videos here that I think you might enjoy. I'll see you next time. Until then, I hope that you stay safe, happy, and healthy. And remember, as always, to be your magic. Bye, everybody. Got nuts.